Comrades and friends, the Communist Party USA extends its warm greetings and sincere appreciation to Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group for organizing this crucial webinar on opposing the US-led Cold War 2.0. Peace and multilateralism are the major issues of our era. The conflict between, on the one hand, a dwindling and weakening US global hegemony, and on the other hand, a burgeoning movement for sovereignty and multilateralism around the world, has become the primary contradiction in the international scene. In 2022, the United States Congress passed the America Competes Act, which, among other things, allocates $500 million for negative news media coverage of China. This legislation is part of the continuation of the anti-communist policies of the Cold War, updated for the post-Soviet reality, a war that we've termed Cold War 2.0. This legislation is explicitly intended to fund negative coverage of China's Belt and Road Initiative specifically. Western media claims that the Belt and Road infrastructure projects are part of debt trap diplomacy or are imperialistic in some other way. Meanwhile, the US-backed International Monetary Fund imposes devastating austerity and privatization measures on developing countries that default on their usurious loans. The imperialists of the world are projecting their own crimes onto the actions of China as part of their anti-communist campaign. Western media spreads claims of forced labor and repression against Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, despite the fact that delegations from many countries and organizations, including the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, have visited Xinjiang and concluded that there was no such forced labor or forced cultural assimilation. Meanwhile, United States prisons openly use forced prison labor, and the US has the highest prison population in the world. In fact, the Uyghur population of Xinjiang is flourishing. Every year, there are more mosques and centers of Uyghur culture being built, and the Uyghur language is taught in public schools. The United States has been pursuing a policy of encirclement and containment against China and runs more than 800 military bases in 80 countries. The rhetoric of the US government, the United States ruling capitalist class, and all of their institutions make it perfectly clear that they are busy manufacturing consent for their Cold War 2.0, which is focused on trying to repress the peaceful rise of China. Today, the American people are suffering from inflation, housing shortages, racist police violence, eroding civil and reproductive rights, student and medical debt, environmental crises, etc. The last thing they want or need is further international conflict, on top of the ongoing proxy wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It should not need to be said that the Chinese people do not want war either. We Marxists know that the working classes of all countries are intrinsically progressive and anti-war. After all, it is our lives that are sacrificed by the capitalists for the interests of the capitalists. And even during times of relative peace, it is our tax dollars that are used to pay for the bloated military-industrial complex, while public services such as healthcare and education are subjected to devastating cuts. The capitalists are well aware of this and know that they must make a constant effort to manufacture consent, or, to borrow a phrase from former CPUSA National Committee member Michael Parenti, they are inventing a reality to justify their wars. So how can we counter this endless confrontational propaganda? Today, there is a trend of increased conflict and destabilization across the world, spearheaded by imperialism and neocolonialism. Countering this, there's been a resurgence in the US peace movement not seen since the start of the Iraq War back in 2003. At the same time, there's been a resurgence in the US labor movement, with labor union public approval ratings at a high not seen since the 1960s. The racist police murder of George Floyd in 2020 led to tens of millions of people hitting the streets in protest against police brutality. The June 2022 overturn of Roe v. Wade induced a surge of activism and voter organization. We've also seen the growth of progressive organizations across the United States and across the world. The Communist Party USA is growing quickly, with thousands of new members joining the party. Other organizations, like those of our friends here, the DSA, Friends of Socialist China, the US Peace Council, the United Anti-War Coalition, the International Manifesto Group, among many others, have seen growth in membership and activity. There's also been a resurgence of progressive media across the internet, with people like Denny Haifong and others creating alternative avenues to inform the masses, who, until recently, had only corporate media available to them to learn about the world. All of these organizations and people are doing fantastic work, and it is an honor to be here with them today. As Marxist-Leninists, we know that all of these crises are symptoms of the crisis in capitalism. Our party calls this the Communist Plus. It is our perspective, informed by Marxist theory and practice, that we bring to these mass movements. If the peace movement is going to be successful, it must build a strong alliance with these movements, and especially the labor movement. While corporate media and bourgeois politicians accuse protesters and progressive activists of being un-American and in league with foreign governments, we all know that the reality is that the working class is simply waking up and fulfilling its progressive role. Part of that progressive role is international solidarity between all workers, and we're very optimistic about this resurgence. We must continue to facilitate people-to-people exchanges between China and citizens of bourgeois states. When people from different countries develop strong ties, it becomes harder for reactionaries to spread false information vilifying people from other countries. This task is much easier than people might assume. In fact, there are currently about 72,000 US citizens living in China today. China issues many visas for tourism, study, work, and more. And recently, China has entered into new visa-free agreements with many countries. To build people-to-people relations, Westerners must be able to see the real China, and not the false image of China portrayed by a Western capitalist media. We hope that the organizations represented at this webinar can continue their good work, fighting for peace and friendship between our countries and China. We hope that their members, as well as all of the working class, will have the opportunity to visit China so that they can share their experiences with their fellow countrymen when they return home. Our efforts in this area have been very good so far, but there are places where we can expand the scope of our work. Western Communist and Workers' parties, for example, should continue to foster fraternal relations between each other and with the Communist Party of China. Lastly, building a connection between the youth in China and the youth in our countries is another important step to ensure that the strong people-to-people ties we are building continue long into the future. Many of the organizations represented here today have vibrant youth wings, including our own Young Communist League. To many people, it may feel at times as though the decisions of war and peace, competition and cooperation, insanity and sanity are decisions made out of sight in shadowy halls. The truth, however, is that there is no force more powerful than the people's will when organized. By building people-to-people relations, by doing what we can to make the world smaller, by talking to each other, and by organizing together, we're building the bedrock of peace and the foundations of a better world. On behalf of the Communist Party USA, thank you.